What's up, sports fans? My name is Lukasweese, host of the Weesports Chronicles podcast. Our next guest is Emma Baccellieri. She is a staff writer at Sports Illustrated covering baseball. In this episode, I chat with Emma about the fallout from the 2020 World Series, reporting on that event virtually, covering baseball amidst a global pandemic, her recent feature on San Diego Padres rookie sensation Fernando Tatis Jr., which appeared in the Sports Illustrated magazine. And we also dive into her career and her various stops along the way, as well as her advice for young journalists looking to break into the industry. The Weesports Chronicles podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, so make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to episode 74 with Emma Baccellieri on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. All right, as I said off the top, I'm pleased to be joined by Emma Baccellieri. She's a staff writer at Sports Illustrated, mostly specializing in baseball. And she's glad enough to join us the morning after the 2020 World Series here on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. Emma, welcome. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, crazy World Series, of course, for my listeners. The Los Angeles Dodgers ending a 32-year drought, defeating the Tampa Bay Rays in 6 games. In a normal year, Emma, we talk about Kevin Cash's managerial decisions, but 2020 is not normal. And that managerial decision gets usurped by Justin Turner's news last night of testing positive for COVID-19 and then going onto the field. So just from your perspective, just how wild was just last night and just covering that from your home, I'm assuming?
Yeah. So I am covering this year from home. We had some changes with our normal coverage due to obviously COVID. So while I'd been there for the World Series in past years, for this year I was doing it from home, which meant that I just heard this announced on television just like anyone else, shortly after that final out, that the reason that Justin Turner had been pulled after the 7th inning was because he had a positive COVID test, which is obviously really shocking to then see him, not long after they announced that, to see him celebrating on the field with his teammates, kissing his wife, hugging his teammates, taking pictures without a mask, passing the trophy around. And obviously there's been some reporting around the timeline trying to suss out just who knew what when and the status of, the test that he took yesterday and the day before. But yeah, I think just really jarring. It's certainly not a good look for baseball, after having the majority of the end of the season, the playoffs passed without serious incident around COVID after the earlier struggles they had with the outbreaks around the Marlins and the Cardinals. It seemed like they'd finally been able to get all of this on track. They had this neutral site for the World Series, neutral sites throughout the playoffs, and the fact that this was still allowed to happen and to become the main story the day after the World Series is, just really not great for MLB.
Well, you're absolutely right, and when you think of how this year began, and just the tense negotiations between the MLB and MLBPA, which of course painted them in a bit of a negative light, leading up to the start of the season, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 positive tests from the Marlins and the Cardinals at the start of the season, and then ending it last night. And I can't just help but think, Emma, how it sort of underscores the importance of, like, you look at the NHL and NBA. They, of course, were in a bubble situation and 0 positive tests. And I just think it's a reminder once again just how complicated playing sports is in this COVID-19 pandemic, and how the virus has no borders, it has no boundaries, and we see how it could possibly have created a real nightmare for MLB if this series ended up going to Game 7.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest questions that needs to be asked right now, and one that I haven't seen a good answer from MLB on is, what was the plan for a Game 7 if the Rays had forced one? Just because I can't imagine that you would be able to do any form of contact tracing and not determine that a fairly significant chunk of the Dodgers had close contact with Turner, if not all of the Dodgers, let alone, the managerial staff, support staff, all of that. And as we saw with past outbreaks in baseball, if you're not taking that very seriously and isolating people right away, it can spread through a clubhouse so quickly. And especially in the bubble environment they were in, which I do think bubble is almost a misnomer because they tried to market it as a bubble, but based on the setup they had, I mean, you had fans in the stands. It wasn't as much of a bubble as we saw the term used for basketball and hockey. But in that environment, players, they were doing lots of socializing back at the hotel, which, was within their rights. They were there for more than a month. They were told it was safe. They would hang out together in their rooms around the grounds of the place they were at. I can't imagine with that situation that you wouldn't have had several Dodgers, in a place to test positive, certainly at least in a place to get extra testing and need to be isolated right away. So I don't see how you could hold a Game 7, on what would have been today as scheduled. And that's just a huge question, along with all of the other ones for MLB right now, with the bigger theme of how could this happen is what were you going to do if it didn't work out the way it did?
And I guess it may be too early to know, Emma, but do you think that we'll ever know whether other players on the field or even, personnel on the team, families would have tested positive as a result of Justin Turner being tested positive for COVID?
Yeah, as of right now on Wednesday, they've said they don't know how long the entire Dodgers traveling party is going to remain in Texas, with extra testing, seeing who needs to potentially be isolated. And I imagine, there should be some results coming out of that. Hopefully everyone is safe and everyone is healthy and those are, negative tests. But I would imagine, and certainly this isn't news that MLB or that the Dodgers want to have to share or have reported, but I imagine we are going to hear something in the coming days about the status of all of those individuals.
So you mentioned how you're covering this World Series at home. You've covered the World Series live numerous times. I'm just curious, Emma, how you felt your coverage had sort of changed this year and how it may have just been affected by not being there live in person, if it did affect your ability to report on this event.
Yeah, so I think for the season as a whole and not just the playoffs, there were kind of two factors here. One was that I had a reason to look into things I had never looked into before, because really with the way that the virus took hold and it shaped the season, it affected everyone's job. So I was able to talk to people like the traveling secretary, the stadium scoreboard operators, people who make the schedule, like all of those people who normally, in a regular season have cool jobs, but not necessarily jobs that are like of serious interest to baseball fans and to writers like myself. Those were all super interesting. Like, how do you schedule a team's travel right now? How are you making this fake crowd noise? What did making the schedule on the fly, after having to scrap the entire original thing, what did that look like? All of those questions were super interesting. And having a chance to just explore those, to talk to people like that who normally aren't in the spotlight, to talk to players' families. I did one story I loved where I talked to just wives of players in different situations who chose, either to stay together or to live separately or not to play at all this season. That was really interesting, and I'm really grateful I had a chance to do that. So in that sense, I think it was kind of, I guess, enhanced, I would say. So just like there were so many opportunities for a sort of coverage that, I never gotten to do before, that I don't think fans had really had a chance to read before. And just because this affected everyone whose lives are touched by baseball, working in the industry, with family in the industry, there were so many more stories to tell. And, that was really interesting and something I guess I would say I was grateful for. But the flip side of that, when it comes to covering the actual games, that was certainly a huge challenge. I did some reporting in stadiums this year, some regular season games. I'm based in DC, so the Nationals were here. I actually covered the Blue Jays' first home game.
Right on.
Here in DC. Yeah. But it's just so difficult when you're used to being able to, talk to any player on the team, to go up in the clubhouse to talk to, the backup catcher or, guy in the bullpen who's not used very much. Like, a lot of times players like that who aren't necessarily made available by the public relations staff when it's just a Zoom press conference, those guys like that you can stop in the clubhouse that don't necessarily have a lot of people talking to them are some of the most interesting ones to talk to. I found, you're able to kind of build relationships like that, to kind of just have a rapport with certain guys and see them day in and day out. And that's really important and a really cool way to get story ideas and to feel like what's going on and with what you're trying to write about. And then apart from that, even like the stars, the guys who do end up being put in Zoom press conferences by the PR staff, when you're able to see them face to face and talk and they see you every day, like that also builds a relationship. And you're able to do better work there. And so to not have any of that, it is a lot harder to report, to find good stories, to feel like you have a decent relationship with the people that you're covering. That's much harder. And I am curious to see what we get for next season, because unfortunately it doesn't look like everything is going to be completely back to normal by March, although fingers crossed. I guess we'll see what the status of things is, but it is certainly more challenging way to report on baseball, though certainly not an impossible one. But I think I still read a lot of good stories by colleagues this year. I still was able to do some stuff I enjoyed, so it's it's still certainly workable. I don't want to make it sound like I'm complaining too much, but it's definitely a different challenge.
No, absolutely. And I think that was a really candid answer, and I think a lot of journalists can definitely relate to that. And I think you mentioned about relationships. I think prior relationships are just so important, especially on the Zoom press conferences where all the other reporters are there. It's not like you can take a player or a manager and one-on-one to get a quote. Like, you have to really think outside the box. And I think the best journalists this year have done that. I mean, you mentioned some of the stories that you wrote that were outside the box, looking at someone, how to score a game, putting in the fake crowd noise. And I found that I really enjoyed those stories. Like, as much as I enjoy the X's and O's, stories about strategy and within the game, I think those sort of stories that you may not expect an outlet to produce, and you did, I just think really added a lot of much needed perspective in a year that was just, I know the word unprecedented is thrown around so much, but it really was. And I think that those stories certainly resonated with baseball fans just looking for an outlet to read about the sport in a completely different way.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, I agree. Like, when I'm thinking back on this season in 5 years, 10 years past that, I feel like what's interesting and what made this year different isn't looking at like, okay, how exactly did the Phillies bullpen fall apart? It was like, how exactly were they playing in empty stadiums and trying to replicate this environment that they couldn't possibly, do perfectly? All of those questions about what made this season so different. That's so interesting. And there's just so much to dig into there. And obviously there was a lot of, baseball to watch and write about too, but the circumstances around it, I just think were, fascinating. A lot of people worked really hard to try to get it to be what it was. Obviously not everything worked out perfectly. But yeah, it just, as you said, tired of using the word unprecedented, but there really aren't that many other ways to describe what we saw this year.
No, absolutely. I subscribe to Sports Illustrated magazine, and I received this magazine in the mail, which consists of your Fernando Tatis feature. I know it's a little weird, magazine, wow, in 2020, but I'm like that. I still subscribe to the magazine, and
thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And Tatis obviously was one of the major storylines of 2020. Definitely captured a lot of headlines. In that feature, how do you start and just like approach from sort of the beginning, pitching that idea to an editor and then getting that piece into the magazine form?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one on the question of how do you do it in COVID times versus, regularly, because in a regular season, I would have just gone to San Diego, spent probably a week with the Padres, talked to a bunch of his teammates, not just the manager, but people up and down the coaching staff, like kind of just all the stuff you can get by shadowing them for even just one series, 3 or 4 days, and then sit down with him. But for this one, obviously you can't do that. My editors asked if I wanted to go to San Diego, but his agent had made it clear I couldn't sit down with him face to face, which was, totally fine. And I understand for COVID safety, of course. So I was like, fly me to San Diego for what? To Zoom him from my hotel room? I didn't think I would ever turn down a work comp trip to San Diego, but this one was just like, it's not going to help the story. So I just did all of that reporting from home. And yeah, because you're not able to get that kind of access, it was just kind of a matter of, I think with a player like Tatis, what made me want to pitch this story in the beginning is he's so dynamic and electric to watch. Like there's so much that you get from just the act of watching him, of how you describe him. And I mean, the stuff he was doing at that point in the season really looked like it was kind of historic for someone as young as he is. And so that kind of made it easier to do without a ton of hands-on reporting. Like I had basically just pitched it as, this has been such a grueling, weird season. Like for, I think a lot of people, the most fun, interesting, bright spot has been the play of Tatis. So I just want to do whatever I can with him. And so that ended up with the reporting I was able to get done, just, talking to him, talking to his manager, general manager, his dad, who's down in the Dominican where he grew up. And yeah, just doing all of that over phone or over Zoom, and trying to get a sense of who he is and, what he's done this year and why it's been so special in the context of this year. And then trying to put it together with, everything we can actually see from him on the field. So definitely different from what I would have normally done in a regular season with that, where I probably would have just gone to San Diego, probably would have had quotes from a lot more people in there, would have had access to a lot more. I think this year has just been about adjusting and figuring out how to, adapt to what's in front of us. And so still able to do stuff over phone, over Zoom, even when you can't go and sit down face to face anymore.
Of those people that you mentioned, and given these adjusted times in terms of interviewing, who would you say was the most challenging to interview given this context of phone interviews or Zoom?
That's a good question. I think I would have really loved to be able to sit down with his dad, Fernando Tatis Jr., face to face, just because he obviously has such an interesting perspective on him, not just as a baseball player, but as a father. But on the flip side, I've talked to players' parents before, and this is also one that has a really interesting perspective on his baseball abilities because he played for so long. And that's kind of just unique to have someone who knows their child as a parent, as a person, and also like very intimately as a baseball player, and is able to evaluate that, the kind of the same way. I mean, exactly the same way a manager was. His father has managed in the Dominican before, in winter ball. So that we had a good conversation over the phone. I enjoyed talking to him. He's, certainly a friendly guy and a great interview, but that's one where I think where there's so much to dig into, and especially kind of that personal background of, it being his son. I think that's the kind of thing where sitting down face to face is really hard to replicate, without, being able to actually sit down with someone and just talk for a little bit.
One of the other things I liked about the piece as well was just sort of integrating narrative with also some of his baseball abilities. I know that you mentioned some, advanced stats like his strikeout rate and things like that, the StatCast nerds like myself would really enjoy. But is that what you try to do, Emma, in a lot of your baseball pieces, is just try to humanize the statistics? Because I find sometimes that, you could get bombarded with stats and you don't get the context around them. And I thought in that piece, you did a really good job of, humanizing and putting into context what, Tatis is doing based on some of the advanced metrics.
Yeah, well, thank you. And that's kind of, I think, a perfect way of describing what I'm trying to do is humanizing those stats, because that was actually one of the big challenges for me when I first came for SI. Like I hadn't written for print in a long time, and so I was used to being able to be a little more advanced than the average fan might know. Just be able to have a link to an explanation. If someone doesn't get this, they can click on it, whatever. And obviously you can't do that in print. Not to mention the fact that with print, you're kind of trying to reach a more general sometimes a little bit older of a reader base. And so having to make sure that it's really kind of accessible for everyone is important. And I think that's a good thing, because it also, I think, makes me a better writer and storyteller, and kind of forces me to think more critically, like, why am I including this specific number? What does it show exactly? And like, what is the story from that number? And I think that forces you to be a little bit choosier with, which stats you're pulling out, just a little more ruthless in selecting what really tells the best story there. Because, yeah, I mean, fundamentally, all baseball stats, I think all sports stats, are storytelling material. And it's just a question of what can tell a story better than others. And sometimes that's the more advanced, the more technical stat, but sometimes you can get more of that story from a number that isn't that. And yeah, it's kind of a challenge sometimes. Sometimes I wish I could just like link to the explanation of sprint speed or whatever and leave it at that. But I do think it kind of forces me to think in more creative ways about what I'm doing, and just should try to, tie it together in a more compelling way for everyone in a broader audience.
You mentioned the transition from web to digital. Of course, you worked for Deadspin before coming to SI. I'm just curious, Emma, I mean, you mentioned some of the challenges of going from digital to print, but what were some of the other adjustments that you needed to make as a journalist in transitioning from those two entities?
Yeah, it's a great question. They're obviously very different outlets, but I think one of the things I appreciate about both of them is the freedom to kind of chase what I want. I mean, obviously, I don't think it would surprise anyone to know SI is a little more buttoned up, not as freewheeling as Deadspin was, but it's still a place where I think they have a lot of trust in their writers, and a lot of willingness to let you do weird stuff, interesting stuff, to hear whatever ideas you have. I think actually kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the coverage I pursued this year kind of fits that. Like I saw, I have some other reporters I read who were kind of more constrained to writing about just the actual baseball, and I just kind of had freedom to go outside of that and write about whatever I wanted as it related to baseball. And I thought the questions off the field there were, in a lot of cases, more interesting than the ones on the field. And SI is a place that really kind of invests in that freedom and is interested in letting writers kind of go after what they want and give you a space to kind of explore that with editors and try to figure those questions out of what you want to do and what makes the most sense. And so in that sense, it's actually a lot more similar to Deadspin than I think people might realize, that both of them are places that care about their writers and want to let people have space to be themselves, even within like institutions that have pretty strong voices and pretty strong points of view. And so that's something that actually has made that transition a lot easier than I think it might seem from the outside, given how different some of the content can be.
It's amazing because I, of course, grew up where every single week I would look forward to going to the mail and getting that Sports Illustrated magazine and reading all of the great articles cover to cover. And now, of course, it's certainly reduced on the magazine side and more of the web side. Do you think, Emma, SI still carries that same name recognition and weight given in 2020 with the rise of different media outlets sort of occupying the space right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no secret that print media doesn't mean what it used to. Mm-hmm. Obviously, as you said, it's now monthly instead of weekly. That's a big change. I think there are lots of larger kind of cultural shifts around how we consume media and what sports media looks like and what people expect from it. But I still think that at its heart, what SI does is important, and that name means something to people. I mean, that's something that I found in reporting all sorts of different stories that, when you call and you're calling from Sports Illustrated, like that's still something that means something to people. I also think the physical copy still means actually quite a bit. I mean, with almost every story I work on, I get asked to like, can this be the cover? Can this be the cover? Which I don't decide and usually don't know until it's sent to the printer. So even if it was the cover, I wouldn't know, while I'm sitting there during the interview. But, that's something that guys care about. That still means something to be on the cover, to be in print. And I think just the question of what the name means and how people care about it and what they get from it, that hasn't gone away. And I think, yes, the print product looks different. It's no longer kind of the central focus of what it means to be SI, but there's still so much work in there that I admire. People working really hard to make it as strong as it can be, even under kind of challenging staffing circumstances sometimes, given, the changes in what print media has had to bring. And that still kind of is something that makes me proud to be at SI all the time.
So can you maybe give the listeners sort of an insight into like the ratio between digital stories and then print stories, and sort of how many are you working on at the same time?
Yeah, that's something that's definitely changed this year. This is the first year it's monthly rather than bi-weekly. So that's, fewer issues. They're usually planned out further in advance. So that means less opportunities to do stuff in print, but it doesn't mean less opportunities to do big stories and try to take big swings, and maybe it'll end up in the mag, maybe it won't. So there's not actually like a huge distinction in like the story planning phase of like, is this for the magazine or is this for online? That kind of can come later. It's just sort of a general encouragement to, to try to work on good stuff and take big swings and see what format it ends up being best for. But for me, I usually have a balance of, I'll be doing 2 to 3 smaller online pieces a week, and then usually have at the same time one bigger feature that I'm working on, 1 or 2 in the background, and those might end up in the magazine, they might not. I had Tatis in this month, and the month before I'd actually had 2 features in the magazine, but I hadn't had any in the 2 months before that. So it kind of just all balances out. And yeah, just kind of a general commitment to trying to do interesting features, along with those sort of quicker daily-ish online pieces, and some of those will end up in the mag and some will.
And I'm sure as well, Emma, like in addition to the written stories, you're probably producing digital content as well, whether it's podcasts or things on the website. So I'm just curious how SI sort of evolved in that space to sort of keep up with sort of the digital times.
Yeah, I mean, we also do a lot of video now, which is not a strength of mine. Still something I'm kind of slowly working on, although now I know how to set up like my ring light and my camera and the microphone,
Nice.
which I don't have with me right now, but like stuff that I had no idea how to touch before this year. That's a big component of it. And yeah, I think just accepting that good, interesting content can come in all different forms, that like social is a form of sharing your stuff, video, podcast, like you said, all of that is kind of wrapped into a bigger question of what it means to be a sports outlet, or really any kind of media outlet now, and just figuring out how all of that fits together. But certainly, like, you can't isolate one piece from the whole anymore, just because all of that is necessary.
It's interesting because I've had several former SI guests on the pod, like Alexander Wolf, Scott Price, Alan Shipnuck, Jeff Pearlman, and it's amazing that they worked at SI, obviously, in a different era where print was a lot more prevalent. But I think they definitely recognize the similar trends that, like you do, that in terms of chasing a story and being willing to go and really dig deep on a feature or a particular topic or trend. Are those names, or, obviously Tom Verducci still works there, like, how did they sort of inspire you to just keep going and keep motivated, especially in a year like 2020 where it could be sometimes difficult to, get up in the morning and produce that content?
Yeah, that's something I take very seriously. I, like you, subscribed to the magazine growing up. It always meant a lot to me. Going to the mailbox every Thursday was such a huge part of, my childhood as a sports fan and as someone interested in writing. And so all of those names have meant a lot to me for a long time. And even now that, I've met with, people like Scott Price and Tom Verducci and worked alongside them. And that still is just kind of like mind blowing to me that, that's something that's, that I've gotten to do. And so I take the legacy that they built at SI very seriously. And my goal with everything that I have in the magazine or, in any capacity for SI is to continue that to the extent that I can, which obviously I'm not Tom Verducci, but just trying to kind of live up to the examples that they've put out and what they've been able to do to build SI into kind of the name that it is. Because there's just so much inspiration to be taken from them. Reading old issues is one of my favorite ways to get ideas to check out stuff that we were doing 20 or 40 or 50 years ago. And so, those names, I think, just mean the world to SI and are at the core of what SI is, are those writers.
You mentioned that you read old issues. Was there a story that stands out to you, or a particular topic that really you drew inspiration from?
Actually, this one, it's not baseball, but it's something I ended up writing about last year, which is I've always kind of been interested in chess, and a story idea I'd had for a while was something looking at how the women's chess championship circuit was changing. Just because that was something as kind of an outsider, like someone who enjoys chess, who plays casually, but like certainly is not a chess person. That was always kind of curious to me that there is this entirely separate championship circuit for women, given that, chess seems like a game where certainly you wouldn't necessarily need gender divisions. So at the end of 2018, I saw we had done a big story with, at the time, Fabiano Caruana, who was the highest ranking American man in a long time, to compete for the men's chess title. And we sent someone to cover it, to profile him. And I was like, okay, like if we're doing this for the men's championship, like I'm going to kind of just shoot my shot and ask my editor, can I just try to figure out something on the women's championship? And they were like, yeah, sure, do whatever. It was December, so it was the baseball off season. I had time. And the first thing I do when I'm doing anything like that is go to the archives and check it out. Because that one I thought was kind of like a silly, fruitless search. Like, of course, we haven't written about women's chess. Like, that's not going to be something I get anything on. And I was totally shocked to find that not only had we done a huge story on it in the early 60s, the first chess player on the cover of SI was a woman named Lisa Lane. There have only been two on the cover ever, Bobby Fischer, which obviously was Bobby Fischer, and Lisa Lane. And Lisa predated him on that by more than a decade. So I was immediately like super interested in that. The story on her was just fascinating. She was kind of she was known for being young and beautiful, and she like partied. This was the early 60s. She was single. Like, she didn't really care about what people thought of her. And at the time, women's chess was very like, it was an activity for married women who were mostly older. It was like very prim and proper, something mostly wealthy women pursued in the States, and she was not any of that. And so she seemed so fascinating from the SI story from 1961. So I tried to find out what happened to her after that, and she just kind of fell off the face of the earth. Like, the last thing I could find was someone had written a book about women's chess stars in like 2003, and they tried to call her, and she hung up the phone and said, like, I don't talk about that anymore. And I was like, okay, like, this is incredible. Like, I need to find out what happened next. And so I found her in the phone book. I called her, and when I said I was from Sports Illustrated, she still remembered Sports Illustrated, calling her in 1961. And I went to her house. I had a really fascinating, long conversation with her, and wrote a really cool piece about her legacy and women's chess now. And it was just so cool. It's still one of my favorite things I've ever worked on. And I think is just kind of the perfect example of not only the cool stuff you can find in the archives with a place whose history is as rich as Sports Illustrated's, but also what that name can mean to people when you pick up the phone, when
Yeah.
you call someone, when they pick up the phone and they hear that, might be a little more interested in talking. So
no, for sure. The name recognition still applies from the 60s till 2020, and it also speaks to the research. I mean, and what I think a lot of young journalists need to be able to do in order to succeed is just being able to be willing to do whatever it takes to chase a story, and whether that's picking up the phone, digging in the archives. I think that skill of having that self-initiative and self-drive is so important, and even if, you know, a story like chess, or whether it's a baseball story, I think it still applies. And I think the more young journalists do that, the more chances I feel like they have to succeed in this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's something that, even as what that work looks like changes, even if, you know, for right now, a lot of it has to be over the phone or Zoom or whatever, like there's no substitute for having a conversation, regardless of what format it has to take.
Obviously, Emma, right now, I mean, for a lot of young journalists maybe listening to this, it's internship season and looking for different opportunities. You, of course, did many internships before getting to where you are now. And I'm just sort of curious, in 2020, what your advice would be to maybe your younger self, you know, going through this industry right now that can be very challenging, it can be frustrating, but as you've mentioned, I mean, lots of opportunities to do some really cool stuff.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would let myself know is just, it's impossible to plan this stuff out perfectly, right? Like I remember being in college and looking at like the LinkedIn profiles of people who were a few years older than me, and like trying to plot it out point by point, like, okay, if they did internship A and then went to internship B and then got job C, like how do I replicate that? I need to do this. And this is the only path to follow. Like if these are the paths I'm seeing, this is what I have to do. And if I can't do it, if I get rejected from these places, and I got rejected from a lot of them, I was like, oh, I'm screwed and I'm never going to get a job, and that's it. Which is not true. Like the industry is changing fast in a way that is unsettling, and it certainly is, I mean, demoralizing. I know how hard it is to look at a field where it feels like it's just getting smaller and smaller, and opportunities are fewer and fewer, and that sucks. And I don't want to downplay how very real like the larger picture is, but when it comes to trying to figure that out with applying to internships and stuff, just being open to take whatever's in front of you that makes sense for you, that's, you know, feasible and fair financially, whatever that looks like. Being flexible and open to different things is, I think, just really important, because you never know where it's going to lead. I actually didn't do any sports internships. I did have, you know, as you said, several internships, but they were all in local news and political reporting. I loved sports. I was interested in sports writing, but like I just kind of, at the first info session for my school paper when I was a freshman, I ended up sitting in news instead of sports, and I liked it, so I just stayed there. And I did all my internships in that. That's what I did all the way through graduation, the year after graduation, until I finally had a chance to switch into something different. And so that's something I never could have predicted when I was interning in, you know, local news at the Charlotte Observer, my hometown in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like I would never have seen this on the radar. So I think just realizing that like one internship or two internships or your first job out of college is not your fate. Like I remember feeling that at the time, that like when I graduated into it was a political internship at a nonpartisan nonprofit newsroom, covering money and politics, which was cool and I enjoyed it, but I was just like, I guess I'm doing this for the rest of my life now. Like, what does this mean? And that was silly. I was 22. Like, there are so many opportunities to be flexible, to float around, to find different things. So just taking whatever you can learn from the place that you're at, whatever internship or, you know, entry job that is. I'm sure there's a lot to learn, lots of good people to learn from, and just trying to soak up as much as you can, and then just, you know, taking it to wherever is next.
No, that's some very good advice. And I think that oftentimes I feel like young people, they may not be willing to maybe relocate for a variety of reasons, but I think taking that yes and saying yes, depending on whatever it is, if you want to get any experience is, to me, good experience. And as you said, you could definitely learn a lot of skills. And I think also too, just I find sometimes I'm in a graduate journalism program myself, and there may be a tendency to sort of compare what other people are doing sometimes. And look, your career is measured in decades and years, not just days and months. And I think that recognizing that you can have a very long career in this business, and everyone has a different trajectory, and once you embrace that, I think you can then find your path and make it work for you in this industry if you work hard and have some of those intangible skills.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Careers aren't linear, I think, in any field, but I think especially in this one, I think also, there's no shame in not working in journalism for a few years and coming back to it if you want. I know a lot of people who have done that. Obviously, it's hard to do something in a steady capacity, unfortunately, in a lot of cases in media, which sucks, but it's totally fine to do what you want to do and chase whatever that looks like for you. And, you can come back, you can try different things. Not working in media immediately or not working in media for a few years doesn't mean that you're never going to do it.
Last question for you, Emma. I always ask this for my guests. As you said, you're living in DC right now. What's the go-to food place right now for anyone going through the Washington, D.C. area?
Right now, my biggest one, and kind of throughout quarantine, although before that too, is the deli on the ground floor of my apartment building is fantastic. The sandwiches are amazing, and it's right by a really nice park, so you can get your outdoor dining in. So's Your Mom in Adams Morgan in DC. It's truly some of the best deli sandwiches I've ever had. I'm not just saying it because it's a good quarantine option for sandwiches and bagels. It's great. The park right here is lovely. But if you want something that's a little nicer, also on my block, because apparently my world has shrunk down to my neighborhood now, there's a really cool restaurant called Mintwood Place.
Right.
It has a lot of great, interesting dishes and a really incredible cheese plate, which is one of my favorites. So
awesome. Well, I mean, once the border reopens in Canada, I'll hope to check those spots off the list of places to try for sure. Emma Baccellieri, she is a staff writer for Sports Illustrated. Make sure to check out her stuff in both the Sports Illustrated magazine as well as online. Emma, thank you so much for coming on today, the Weesports Chronicles podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.